land, said Marcos. Many Roman soldiers retired from the army there and took Carthage women as their wives to live out their days, and Rome was pleased because it increased the Roman citizenship. Many years later the Egyptian queen was born in 40 BC. She was both called Cleopatra and the Ptolemaic princess because she was half Egyptian by her mother Helene II and half Greek by her father Marius Anthony. Her parents died during the naval invasions by the Roman Empire that left her and the rest of her siblings at the mercy of the Roman government, sighed Marcos. They separated my grandmother from her twin brother and younger sister to be prepared for her future arranged marriage to the Roman emperor's son, Augustus Caesar, who only married her because of her ties to Egypt. He banished her after only 2 years of marriage because she did not bear him a son. Marcos sighed. Augustus Caesar, my great-grandfather, took Lady Velusia Cornelia as his new wife after he exiled my grandmother to Carthage, the land of the seafaring people. He never wanted to remember grandmother or my mother again until it was time to find a new successor to the throne of Rome. His wife demanded that he fully divorce my grandmother Cleopatra II, but my grandmother refused to relinquish any rights to his empire. Because she still was in love with my grandfather, he was her first love, Marcos said as tears began to fill his eyes. Cleopatra II, in return to his request, preposterously refused to sign any documents sent by her husband's messengers. My grandfather raged from within by her failure to compromise to his orders and made a personal trip to the city of Carthage himself, and after that day she was never seen again. People say that they heard him tell her that he wished that he had never met her or my mother. My mother found her body laying cold in her bed with a bottle of poison by her side and a letter that she simply wrote, "Forgive me." 1 year later my grandfather, the Emperor Augustus Caesar himself, was sought after in an unsuccessful assassination attempt. Some believe it was my grandmother's followers seeking revenge against him. Marcos laughs. He was left with a horrid scar on the upper left side of his throat. But because of this attack he exterminated his entire council of advisors and close friends. Marcos sighs. So then it is my grandmother who we must fight on the hill. Oh no, I replied. I am so sorry, Marcos. I meant it this time because something about me was changed. Silence. Marcos commanded. I will hear of no such thing. Do you think I need your sympathy? Do you have any idea who I am? Marcos cried. Yes, I do, Marcos, I said. You are a man that has been tormented his whole life and you are my friend. The two of us both cried because at that moment we knew why we were connected together and traveling through hell. We were the same person, just created at different times in the world, but with the same heart. Young strong men that were torn apart inside from their turbulent childhoods. The environment of hell kept them focused on making it to the gates of hell, where they would have to fight and only one of them would be granted access back into the earthly dimension. Move out, Marcos yelled. Let's go, I replied. We go together from here on and we stick together back to back. When we fight. Marcos commanded. Follow me through the mountainous area of hell underneath the mountain Jebel Akra. It is the location under earth in which we will travel to get to the top of the mountain of knives. This mountain is also where the palace of Baal is hidden in the ashes of the huge mound guarded by his angels of destruction. Marcos said. According to legend, many great battles were fought in that place, and Baal was the spirit of the air who caused many storms and thunders in those mountains. The inhabitants of the great mountain knew Baal, and they called him the Storm King because he waged war from the seas. The seas was the place where the princes of the air assembled to create chaos on the earth and its people. The citizens of Jebel Akra sacrificed their firstborn man-child and their virgin daughters to Baal to appease his destruction over their land. Baal is that ancient demon from hell described in the book of Exodus who caused war upon land with kingdom against kingdom. Marcos said. Now we head to the Zephyr, the guardian of the north entrance to the mountains. Marcos said. What do I do? I asked. You do what I tell you to do, my brother, and you live. Marcos replied. Will Zephyr try to fight us when we try to enter the corridor to the north? I asked. There is constant battle and nothing is given without sacrifice in hell. He will try to destroy us. Zephyr will not want us to make it to the mountain. He will send his army against us, so I need to prepare you for battle against them. Marcos replied. We will stop here and train. Marcos said. Now the art of swordsmanship is explained as thus. Marcos explained. As I prepared myself to be trained in the ancient art of sword fighting by the great Saint Longinus. As a gladiator, I was instructed how to use a sword correctly for the sole purpose of bringing death to my opponents and glory to my victories. To truly master this art form, we will examine the Eastern ways of sword fighting skills. Marcos sighs. Now, on guard. Marcos shouts. Wait, I'm not ready yet. I replied. You must always be ready in hell to fight the powers that be. Marcos said. Now, on guard. Marcos said again. Chapter 6. Warrior. Now handling a sword takes years to master, but you must master this art in a short time or you will be destroyed, Robert. Now. Move. Jump. Guard yourself. Marcos said. Cling. Sounds of metal banging against each other as Marcos and I engage in fighting the fight of death in hell. Keep your right foot planted on the ground. Hold your guard, Robert. Hold your ground. Now drop your weapon to the ground and fight me hand-to-hand combat style. Marcos shouted. Marcos began to swing his arms at me with lightning speed in the epic way that his legend describes him as, and all I was able to see was his meaty fist of steel glaring from the quick moves that Marcos formed with his hand, as Marcos demanded that I dodge him and duck as he swung at me, speeding up his maneuvers of ancient fighting artwork. I wanted to give up, so I dropped my sword and ran from Marcos' dangerous blows, but there was nowhere I could hide. In the background I could hear the angry growls of monsters and demons that hoped they could get close enough to me to wipe me out. Marcos swung this time, landing his meaty fist in my center chest, almost caving in my entire abdomen area, knocking me on my back. Get up, you piece of trash. Marcos commanded. Get up, you worthless coward. Marcos, delighted and insulting, I think. But I got up on my feet and angry this time by Marcos' insults about me, but continued to fight. Marcos swung at me, but this time I swung back, surprisingly connecting to Marcos' lower jaw. Marcos' speed increased with every round, so did mine as I realized a newfound confidence. That's it. Fight. You're going to have to fight me if you want to make out of here alive. Marcos shouted. What is happening to me? I asked out loud. I am teaching you the of supernatural speed that you will need to fight the enemy down here. Marcos replied. You are wearing me out, Marcos, I said, because I thought I was going to pass out from exhaustion. I cannot take any more. Please stop. Stop, I said. Stop. Please? I cried out. If I stop, you will never learn. Marcos replied. Marcos continued to teach me, this time with his sword moving at lightning speed as he maneuvered around me, jabbing straight for my pressure points. He would jump in the air, swinging his blade in a 45-degree angle on the sides of my head and then my body while landing back to the ground. He had the speed of a cheetah and the grace of a butterfly as he trained me in the art of war with the sword. In his teaching he qualified me as a warrior of the sword, that is until could take no more and collapse to the ground in a ball of tiredness. The sound of spectators gathering started to fill that region of hell like the sound in the arena that Marcos once knew all too well. The sound of razor-sharp spikes of the claws of the evil monsters began to surround Marcos and I. We sword fought in the dark red acidic smoke of hell. Tension builds as Marcos kicks me with the heel of his right foot in the chest, sounding off like a great bass drum as he sends me flying off in the distance into darkness. The monsters went wild as I went flying through the air, anticipating me landing in the grasp of their savage ways. But Marcos takes off in flight after me before the beast can go to work on my body. They who have enjoyed demolishing me to a complete annihilation. "Get up! Get up!" I said. Marcos shouted. As the monsters started to cheer in a frenzy of chaos, relishing the opportunity to taste my blood and engulf their teeth into the guts of my flesh. "We have no time for resting. On your feet!" Marcos shouted. Marcos forcibly grabbed me by the neck and flung me a great distance to the ground close to the river banks. Then he walked slowly toward me, and when he did, a monster's tail came out of the river to take me away. The monster's tail wraps itself around my ankle and slowly started to pull on me toward the Black River, where it could consume me fully. The background was filled with enchantments and noise of demons having conversations, waiting for our next move as I shouted out, "Marcos, help me!" Marcos ran full speed to me with his sword flaming with white fire as he leaped in the air toward the monster's tail in aims to chop it off. But when he had landed on the ground, the monster had already released me and slithered back into the river. Once Marcos seen the tail vanish back into the river, he grabbed me by the leg and dragged me away from the bank of the river like a rag doll. "Get up!" Marcos yelled. "Your sword is there. Pick it up and move out," Marcos commanded. The monsters were still at bay, waiting for us to make a mistake and open ourselves up to an attack. Marcos instructed me to swing my blade directly down, aiming toward the shoulders of the opponent, reassuring me that this was the most dangerous avenue of attack because it damages the skull, neck, and spine of its victims all at the same time. He also instructed me to not to get too close to my opponents while fighting because I could become fatally wounded by the enemy's blows. Marcos turned to me, hinting that I should beware of the audience that would be joining us soon, and that eventually we were going to have to make a run for it. I guess the sound of our fighting had attracted many demons and monsters to our whereabouts. "Run!" Marcos shouted. "Don't let them surround us," Marcos commanded. But it was almost too late because we could hear the monsters beginning to circle us as the sound of screams and total chaos began to fill hell even more. Marcos and I ran to the bank of the river, bursting through the line of demons that formed around us in hopes to surround and consume us with force. Marcos and I ran for hours up and down trenches and valleys until we reached a valley with fewer demons on our trail. "We will rest here," Marcos commanded. Chapter 7. Champion Spirit. It seems like I am developing you to become an expert in the art of war. This is the gift I have given you because you already had the natural abilities to train Robert, and you will use it to make it out of this hellish place alive. Marcos said. You will combat with evil forces that would tear mortal man to fragments. Though you still lack in some areas like focus, but that will come with more hard training. You can't hop straight into fighting these demons by yourself without my help. Take advantage of me being here to instruct you because I might not always be with you, Robert, Marcos said as he sighed. Now what you don't possess in talents and gifts you will have to make up in agility, strength, and strategy. You must now focus, my brother, on becoming an intelligent warrior that knows what battles to fight and which ones to run away. For instance, We did not stay and fight those demons back there because I might have won, but you would have died because your energy is too weak to fight. But I just ran for hours. Robert explained. Running is much easier than fighting any day of the week, Robert. Marcos replied. Robert, you are becoming a great sword fighter and warrior, but I want you to know that you have yet to become a champion. To be a champion, you must conquer the storms in your life, no matter what it brings. Marcos said. Why do you say that? I asked. Because Robert, you now possess what is called a warrior spirit, but not everybody can acquire even that, but what you need is a champion spirit. As you begin to fight more and more down here, you will move closer and closer to what it is I like to call the champion spirit. Marcos replied. Not only is being a champion created by your achievements, it is also the notion of knowing who you are. Marcos said. What do you mean knowing who I am? I asked. In order for one to know one's true self, he must first know his heart. Marcos instructed me. What are the steps of becoming a champion? I asked honestly. Well, firstly stand to your feet like the warrior you are and take up your sword and follow my lead. Now stand up straight and pull up your pants like a true warrior and not messy looking. Okay, now I want you to breathe in deeply and exhale slowly while you feel your spirit rise inside of you slowly. Marcos commanded. It should feel like a swelling inside your gut and then to your head. This is a power moment, Robert. Marcos said. Now I want you to accept the heart of a champion. Now touch your chest. Can you feel that bass drum inside your spirit strike against your chest in cadence 1, 2, 3, 4? While the beat of the drum is thumping against your chest, tell yourself I am great. Marcos commanded. I am great, I said. Say it again, said Marcos. I am great, I repeated. As Marcos was talking, the demons and monsters started to circle around us once again, but this time they don't close in. They just look at Marcos and I with their mouths open in anxiety, as if something great was about to happen. The evil spirits can feel light entering into their sanctuary of darkness, and it makes them tremble from fear of being judged. Marcos said. The demons were frozen in their steps as they look on to see Marcos shouting at me with the voice of a champion as I repeat after him. Marcos commanded me to say it even louder as I repeated after him. Now you say it like you lost your mind. Marcos commanded. I am great, I replied. Say it again. Marcos said. But this time say your name and end it with I am great. Marcos said. My name is Robert Powers and I am great. I shouted. Say it again, Robert. Marcos shouted even louder this time. My name is Robert and I am great. I repeated. Robert, how do you feel now? Marcos asked. I felt clean like a whistle, as if I had a new soul and spirit. I felt so much stronger now, and the fear had left my body, along with the pain and heartache of being down here in chaos and darkness. I felt like an eagle with long wings that could fly wherever and whenever I wanted to without anything stopping me. So I told Marcos that I felt like treasure. Yes. You got it. This is what greatness feels like when you're on top of the mountain. But woe when your valleys come. Marcos said as he grinned. What does this all mean? I sincerely asked. Your heart is now ready to become the champion you were born to be. Now let us go so that we can arrive to the other side. Let me encourage you, Robert. Marcos replied. If I shall not make it with you outside of these gates, you can and will make it through the storms of not only hell but also the storms of life. Robert, you shall live and not die, and I speak this over your life. Marcos sincerely replied. Chapter 8. Mountain of Knives. Now follow me, Robert, to the Mountain of Knives as I continue telling you my story." Marcos sighed. As the city of Carthage grew in riches, it also grew with slaves who built the giant towers made of wood, marble and stone. The African people were very gifted in craftsmanship as they decorated the structures throughout the city. There was also a famous Colosseum in the city that held that great blood sport of the gladiators who fought to the death. The emperor at that time loved these famous exhibitions greatly, and this is where he sent me to train as a little boy. "Wow," I said. "Marcos, you are a gladiator." "Yes. It is how I got the name Marcos, the Great. After my father and mother renounced their loyalty to the emperor, they were martyred and I was sold into slavery." Marcos replied. Marcos and I continued on our journey to the Mountain of Knives, and for the first time the sound of unspeakable torture and cruelty to souls far away in the darkness didn't make me cry. I was a soldier now and ready for battle against any evil foe in the place called chaos and confusion. The sound of workers building in the background started to awaken our senses as it became louder and louder as Marcos and I drew closer to the mountain. Prison concentration camps were used to punish those that committed great acts of evil on the earth and for the leaders of the world who deceived many people away from the teaching of God the Father. The smell thickened, but I was not affected by its stench as it reeked of destruction. "I would want to wish this place on my worst enemy," I said. "Me either, Robert," Marcos agreed. Still we moved all the while, even with the sound of women screaming from the tortures taking place right before our eyes from the beast in hell. I looked off in the far distance and was able to see a woman being tortured to death, beaten as she crawled on the ground, too terrified to call for help against her abuser for fear that he would beat her the more. I, with my newfound champion spirit, wanted so much to help her, but Marcos restrained me, because there was nothing I could do, for they were of the system of hell in all its abominableness. The great concentration camp of the underworld where all earthly prisons mimicked but could only hope to prelude not even a tenth of its origins. This place was indescribable by man and all of his most thought-provoking fancies. This place was filled with terror and unrest as the souls wailed out in complete surrender of destruction forever. Marcos and I entered a low place where we then saw the Mountain of Knives almost clearly through the sweltering air. As we moved closer, readying ourselves for an attack, nothing happened. I guess it wasn't quite time yet. So we just continued to move toward the mountain to find no guards there, but an older woman of nobility who waited for us there. She looked like a fortune teller. Her eyes were gray purple like the dragon's eyes, and she didn't speak loudly, but she pointed and whispered at us to come closer. Her black dress was clothed in war, and she could become a weapon quickly if need be to fight the forces of good, which was us two lads. I could tell as Marcos focused in on her more, he noticed her. She looked familiar, as if he had seen her once before, maybe in his youth. I just kept turning my head to see this spooky-looking woman, because I noticed Marcos' amazement as he looked on at this woman of nobility. Still waiting for any signs of attack, the two of us moved in closer, ever more cautious with each step. I looked behind my shoulders, anticipating an ambush and then a possible right flank. To my surprise, no indications of any flanks in either direction, but still we refused to let our guards down. The woman was now standing directly in front of us, and she asked Marcos to follow her while promising my safety until their return. Marcos looked at me for approval, so I nodded my head yes. Marcos and the woman walk off to converse about some important matter. "So I have been waiting for you, Marcos the Great," the woman said. "Really? How so?" Marcos asked. "Well, you see, I knew your mother very well, but she is not here and I miss her very much. So you must understand, seeing you reminds me a lot of her. This is why I allowed you two lads to enter into my mountain without being destroyed. You both should know that I could have had you and your friend destroyed with just a snap of my finger, but I allowed you to stay alive." You must be thinking why? The woman conferred to Marcos. Yes. Marcos replied. Well, because of me. Your mother was well educated in the office of politics, and she could talk her way out of almost anything except, of course, death. The old woman replied. So you see, my Marcos, we all must die at some time, and this is why you are here, because at some point you die. Life failed you many times, and so did your family, so you ended up here in hell talking to me and wondering who I might be. The woman of nobility said. Okay, who are you? Marcos said while examining this woman. Well now, young lad, I have been known by different names. But when you look upon me, what do you see, Marcos, the Great? The woman asked. I see a woman that was once very great upon the earth. But what happened to you? Marcos replied. I do come from a dynasty of great kings, queens, and pharaohs. I am from Africa, the mother of the earth, with all its splendors of resources and life. The woman replied. You are the great Cleopatra? Marcos asked. Oh, Marcos, the woman said with a big old grin. Marcos, I am your grandmother, my son, and I want you to join my forces as the great general you are. Marcos, you will never leave hell, but that boy you are with will leave hell, and he might warn the people on the earth about this place. This will cause us to lose great numbers in hell before the great battle is to come. So this is why you must join us and stop him from entering back into Earth's atmosphere. Elaine II replied. Grandmother, oh grandmother, alas, how I have longed many days to see your face. Marcos said. And me yours, my dear grandson. Elaine III said. But I have come too far with this man to turn from him and kill him. You must understand that he is my friend and brother in arms. Marcos replied. Well, your so-called friend will leave you here in hell to burn forever, while he will get a second chance at life to make it into heaven's gates. Elaine III shouted. If that be the truth, so be it, grandmother. I will not betray him. Not even for you. Marcos replied. Marcos, wipe those tears swelling in your eyes away, because if you long to be with someone you could love, why would you join sides with someone who sentenced me to hell? But let me guess, you didn't know I would be here too. How does it feel, Marcos, to know we are now enemies too? I hope it makes your time the more unbearable. Out of my sight, Marcos, before I destroy you now. Elaine II yelled. Marcos ran quickly to grab me to escape the clutches of his angry grandmother Helene II of that old city of Carthage. As we were escaping, she screamed out at us like a wild banshee. If I see you here again, I will destroy you both. Till we meet again. Helene II shouted out in disgust as she watched us run away. What was that all about? I asked. That was my grandmother. Marcos sighed. As Marcos and I continued down the ridges of the mountain of knives, all the while Marcos tried his best from tearing upward, as I could feel his heart being ripped from his chest from the new void he had just incurred in hell. Marcos and I both remained silent as we traveled down the other side of the mountain, not even as much as a peek from the two of us. And then suddenly a stampede of hellhounds that had been ordered by their master. Probably it was Helene II that gave the command to attack Marcos and I as we were moving downhill. These mangy mutts were no match for Marcos and my skillful sword fighting tactics, destroying them all with just one blow from our swords. The leader of the hellhound was annihilated as it was sliced in half. That sent a message of fear to the rest of the pack as they quickly followed in their demise. This battle was instrumental in helping Marcos forget about what had just happened on the mountain. He was somehow able to continue his story where he left off about becoming a champion after being moved from Judea. Chapter 9. The Old City. The boundaries of Judea was the perfect position for Rome to conquer because of its location and place throughout history. This region is surrounded by frontier and water boundaries like the Dead Sea and Jordan River. These boundaries made it hard for enemy troops to make a surprise attack against this province because the city was set on high. Marcos said, "I know there is a lot of history in that part of the world." I replied, "Yes." Marcos answered, "This is why war was so significant in this region, because the lands were sacred due to the many historical wonders that took place in the land. The people and land here are referred to as the birthplace of human civilization and government. In those days Judea was called Palestine, which means the land between the two waters, Jordan River and Mediterranean Sea." "Why was there so much war in the land?" I asked. "Well," Marcos sighed, "because man has a strong desire to have property, glory, and relationships." Marcos replied, "This is what happened with my grandfather Augustus Caesar when he decided to send my mother to the Judea province to keep an eye on his tax money. He purposely sent her on these journeys so that my mother might one day encounter a man to someday wed as her husband in a province far away from Rome. My grandfather hated my mother because she was his firstborn and she was a girl. This meant that she was a curse to my grandfather's reign as Caesar. That's why his mission was to rid himself of my mother's existence in hopes of covering up his fading past." Marcos said, "How could he be evil as a ruler over people that were loyal to his every word?" I asked. "I have pondered these thoughts all my life, and even now in hell I still do not know," Marcos responded. "When did Rome conquer Judea?" I asked. "Good question," Marcos replied. "Everyone knows that Syria was defeated first, leaving Judea wide open for invasion by forces from the north at the right time. The great Queen Salome Alexandra had just died, leaving behind two zealous and priestly sons that were high priests in the temple. Because of their religious and political views, power and control eventually raised envy between each other, resulting in a civil war. Their kingdom was divided because of religious beliefs, and Aristobulus II was victorious in battle, that is, until Pompey joined the fight. Pompey and his army surrounded the fortress of Judea and battled for many days without retreat. Once Pompey weakened the Aristobulus army enough, he took the city by force." Marcos sighed. "This is how Rome conquered Judea," Marcos said. "They are coming again," I shouted. "Yes, I knew they would after I told you this story," Marcos said. "Shall we?" I was as ready for them as could possibly be as I replied. "Yes, we shall," Marcos replied. This time a legion of demons were headed straight for Marcos and me as we stood armed at the ready with flaming swords as we pressed against ourselves back to back. The evil things surrounded us and closed in as we leaped in the air, clinging each other's swords together, causing the flames to grow even larger. As we swung our blades in opposite direction, a bubble started to boil, and when it touched the devils, they exploded and disappeared. This didn't stop the army of demons from trying to fight though. It was as if they were on a suicide mission this time, probably on orders from their commander and chief, the Red Dragon. The crowd of demons ranted while waving their weapons in the air, cheering and chanted as we fought. The ears of hell were listening to what was going on as battle sounds got louder and louder. Marcos and I still back to back as we fought with deadly accurate speed and precision. The fire of the war zone was full of death as Marcos stared down the face of his foe with that grimace look of a battle cat that earned him the name Marcos the Great. I wasn't doing too badly either, especially for a newly trained warrior. Marcos fought so great, leaping in and out of the sphere as he kicked the enemy in the chest with his boots. Marcos and I shook hands as we employed our martial arts skills. We twirled in the air sideways, running on the faces of the demons, pushing them back in the process. As we hit the ground, swords aimed at the ready and all, severing the body parts of the evil creatures. This is our territory. The demons cried out as they were totally defeated. A great smoke arose in the midst of the fight, and when the smoke cleared, the army was no more. They had been slain by Marcos, and as we walked around, Marcos stopped to place his foot on the neck of the largest one. "You're learning, Robert. But don't let it go to your head," Marcos said. "Never," I replied. "What do we do now?" I asked. "Our next objective is to get to the gates of hell so that you may continue your mission on earth," Marcos replied. "Let's go in this direction. We will travel westward," Marcos suggested. As we walked in the western direction, still hearing the sounds of gnashing teeth and screams in the distance from tormented souls that had been cast into the great lake of fire, Marcos begins to tell me more about how he came into being called Marcos the Great. "Well," Marcos sighed, "I must finish telling you my story before you are released," Marcos said. "My grandfather, the Emperor of Rome, ordered my mother to travel to Judea on a 6-man human carriage accompanied with Roman centurions as her guard. She traveled very eloquently in her carriage, laced in fine rubies and filled with rose petals. She noticed my father, a Roman centurion soldier at the time, but tried to ignore him. However, he got wind that she might be interested, so he started making serious eye contact at her and taunting smiles to see if she would respond back to him." "Are we getting romantic, Marcos?" I said jokingly. "Silence," Marcos shouted. "Just listen for now, I'm doing the talking," Marcos said. "Phew, okay," I replied. "Well, now," Marcos sighed, "my father was one of the new Roman guards handpicked to escort my mother to the new jurisdiction of Judea inhabited by the Mosaic people south of the Roman Empire. This place had gone through a mass amount of changes because of the city's history of wealth from King Solomon and the inheritance of sacred connections," Marcos said. "Nevertheless, the centurion named Longinus was told that he was to lead that day as a companion to the emperor's daughter as she traveled to Judea. Longinus was riding a heavily armored horse in the front ranks of the convoy of guards for my mother. Guards had to convoy people of nobility whenever they traveled to foreign lands. My mother, Drusilla, was escorted that day in hopes to meet her old friend that had just been promoted to governor," Marcos sighed as he continued. "People have told me that in those days she was very lofty and superficial before, of course, my father Saint Longinus decided to change religions. My mother Drusilla was outraged by my father Longinus' behavior as a Roman soldier when they first met that day, because he was making passes at my mother unbecoming of a professional soldier. So my mother did not appreciate his advances and was ready to report his conduct to the governor upon their arrival to Judea," Marx replied. "You see, these gestures were outlawed in those days and the penalty was death by crucifixion, so it was hard for my mother Drusilla to understand why my father was livid enough to pull such an exploit." Marcos looked and smirked as he said, "Marcos, if all this is true, how did you become a slave and gladiator?" I asked. "Silence," I said. Marcos replied. "If you would listen, I will tell you how this all came to be," Marcos said as he continued with his story. Then all of a sudden, in the midst of the horizons, a shout rung out by one of the Roman guards, "Protect Her Majesty at all cost." This evil grunting wild boar was charging straight toward my mother Drusilla. Some said that perhaps it could smell the assortments of wild berries and wine in her carriage, and it wasn't after my mother but her food and refreshments that it probably smelled in the air miles away. Nonetheless, this hideous creature from hell was on a mission to stop my birth. Its body was solid as a rock with 2 6-inch fang-like tusks slobbering with its psychopathic gestures of its mouth as it leaped in the direction of my mother," Marcos said. My father Longinus immediately hurtled off his horse with one blow to the head from his spear. The beast was slaughtered in mid-flight. leaving the bloody pig now dying only a few feet away from my mother. The smelly beast breathed its last breath. The momentum of the fall landed the wild boar right beside my mother. Drusilla had fallen off her carriage onto the ground in all the confusion as she looked on in the path of the gruesome beast. As she regained her focus and the dust cleared, she saw my father gazing upon her. Marcos sighed. My mother found a new admiration for my father on that day because she saw a different image of that Roman centurion as he asked, You hurt Her Majesty?" said Marcos. "Well," Marcos sighed. Word of the attack spread all throughout the Roman Empire, making Longinus a hero, and my grandfather the emperor eventually heard about this request and became even more embarrassed for whatever reason. The Emperor Caesar decided to indefinitely confine my mother to that far region in the east. His explanation was that she should keep an eye out should a revolt take place. Marcos said. "Wow, Marcos," I said. "That's incredible." "I know," Marcos agreed as he continued. Now, rumors was surfacing around the empire that a Jewish king was expecting to arise very soon, and he would not be ordained by the Republic of Rome. The Roman government had elected Herod I king of Judea, which later became one of the greatest builders in Roman history. He commissioned the rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem after murdering Jewish priests that disagreed with his decisions to change traditions of the temple. He died around 4 BC, just 4 years before the declaration of a new king and savior born in Bethlehem had reached the ears of his son Herod II. Marcos said. "Marcos, what are you saying?" I asked. "Listen and I will tell you more, Robert," Marcos replied. A new king meant a new empire, which meant a threat against Herod II, king of the Jews, to include the world power of Rome. King Herod II ordered a mass murder decree, and it was to behead every firstborn man-child in the province of Judea. The centurion stationed under King Herod rule swept through the region of Judea, murdering every firstborn man-child, leaving much blood and weeping in the land during that time. Marcos said. I had heard this all before, as I told Marcos. Marcos continued. Yes. My mother reluctantly agreed to relocate to Judea under the protection of her longtime friend, the governor, previously, after the tragic and violent event that left so many motherless. My mother, Drusilla, was accustomed to those lands even before my grandmother's disappearance, so she was curious to see the aftermath of the massacre because she had former experiences in that land. From time to time, her and my grandmother would get invited to special occasions to sit with great politicians when they visited the city of Carthage. Marcos said. While living in the city of Carthage, she met the young statesman Pontius Pilate and his newly wedded young beautiful wife. Pontius Pilate, a newly stated governor by her father the emperor, visited Carthage quite often because he had a trading port there where he stored his soldiers' supplies. Governor Pontius Pilate would also be at these auctions to negotiate trade, so my mother had history with him. Marcos replied. Chapter 10. Marcos Longinus. The Gladiator. The emperor ordered Governor Pontius Pilate to arrange for his daughter's travel to his home and also commissioned him to find her a centurion soldier to marry in hopes to have a grandson that would one day be the general of the Roman Empire. Because of my mother Drusilla's royal ancestry, the governor ordered his most skilled soldiers to accommodate Her Majesty throughout the eastern province. Shortly after Drusilla's arrival, she turned 24 years old when she settled in Judea. My father Longinus and her were married. Perhaps she fell in love with him that day. He saved her life from the wild boar episode. Marcos said. Drusilla was 2 years older than Longinus when they married in the court of the governor's estate. I was born 7 years after they are married in 9 CE. When Augustus heard about me grandson, he immediately requested for my mother's return to Rome. He wanted me to train there to be a great general in his army. Marcos sighed. I became friends with Tiberius, the boy my grandfather adopted in my mother's place. Legend has it that he found Tiberius in the streets of Rome one day fighting centurion that slapped his brother in the face for not bowing down while Augustus Caesar paraded down the streets of Rome. Marcos said, "This was worthy of death on sight, but the guard, seeing that the lad was young in age, decided to only backslap him with his fist, knocking Tiberius' brother Nero Claudius Drusus to the ground and shouting for him to bow, infuriating Tiberius, causing him to pick up a rock and heave it straight into the head of the centurion. The furious centurion takes after Tiberius throughout the streets of Rome but fails to catch the young lad. Tiberius manages to run in the area of Augustus Caesar and plead for his life and brothers. Augustus, feeling admiration for the boy, decided to adopt them both, thus ending his search for his successors." Marcos sighed. Maidens were then sent to the two young lads to prepare them to enter into the gates of the palace in full decor. They were revered as majesty by the people of Rome that same day, and Augustus Caesar was finally able to rest at night, knowing that his empire rests in the hands of two with the hearts of kings. Tiberius quickly became an important officer in the Roman Empire, while Nero continued in his training. Marcos said, "By the time I had arrived at the palace after my training, Tiberius was already a general, so he decided to take me in his rank of soldiers to keep an eye out for me, no doubt. From the beginning I was gifted and talented in the skills of war and was recruited at 19 years old as a centurion. My first job in the army was to torment captured enemy personnel until later, when I was commissioned to fight on the front lines. I never forgot what I learned from the gladiator trainers on how to detach body parts from men swiftly while in battle. I had become so good, in fact, that Tiberius asked my grandfather to let me participate in the annual Clash of the Animals, which was the goriest of battles in Rome at the time." Marcos said, "This battle started off with gladiators being released to fight each other for the first 5 minutes, and then wild hungry animals of all types would be released into the Colosseum to add even more excitement as the crowds rend as gladiators swoon into battle. But not I," Marcos replied. "I would just stand unshaken as my sword pierced through the flesh of foes, bruising the heads of both man and beast. Then the wild evil bulls were released, piercing the hearts of men with razor-sharp horns, putting to shame the owners of the gladiators as they plummeted into Death's Valley." Marcos said, "I was the last man standing as I raised my sword in the air with victory. The people fell in love with me after that day, and Tiberius privately insisted that I fight with him in battle during the celebration that was held in my honor. Tiberius toasted to my victories as Augustus Caesar, my grandfather, looked toward me in admiration. I felt as if Augusta began to have a change of